On the music street, we are in between that singing. How could we music be mistaken? A young woman with only $20 in her pocket and songs that no one wanted to hear got off a Greyhound bus in Nashville in 1967. Executives told her she would never succeed in country music, made fun of her large blonde hair, and laughed at her high-pitched voice. However, this woman would go on to write over 3,000 songs, create an empire valued at over $650 million, and emerge as one of the most adored individuals in American history. One woman rose from a cottage in the Smoky Mountains without electricity and went on to conquer the world. Who turned rejection into fortitude? I will always love you in 9 to 5, Jolene, who offered the world. However, there is a tale of terrible losses hidden under the wigs, rhinestones, and that recognizable smile. Millions of riches could not heal the scars, and the battles fought in the dark. How did a one-room cabin's barefoot girl become a worldwide celebrity? What did she give up to get to the top? Why does she still have wounds that fame will never be able to heal after 60 years of celebrity? And at the most lucrative point in her career, what nearly caused her to abandon everything? Before we can respond to those music questions, we must go back to her early years, the time of extreme poverty, starvation, and humiliation that influenced all she would grow up to be. On January 19, 1946, Dolly Rebecca Parton was born in a one-room cabin located in the middle of the Great Smoky Mountains, near Locust Ridge, Tennessee. Born into a household where poverty was more than just a circumstance, she was the fourth of 12 children. Every waking moment was determined by this style of living. Robert Lee Parton, her father, was a construction laborer and sharecropper who was illiterate. His hands were bleeding and calloused from the very long days he spent working in the tobacco fields. However, the money he brought home was never sufficient. Even when there was little food on the table, her mother, Avie Lee Parton, filled her children's bellies with songs rather than food. She was a woman of quiet strength music. They lived in a cabin without running water, electricity, or insulation against the bitterly cold alpine winters. A room barely big enough for 4 kids was packed with 12. Wrapped in threadbare quilts made from flour sacks, they slept 3 or 4 to a bed. The kids would wake up shivering in the winter, their breath visible in the freezing air as ice formed on the inside of the windows. Dolly would later recall with heartbreaking honesty, "We were dirt poor. I mean, seriously poor? We didn't have 2 nickels to rub together." But it wasn't just material poverty that scarred her. At school, she was the girl the other kids whispered about. She wore clothes stitched together from rags, whose shoes had holes so big her toes poked through. She remembered standing in line at school, watching the other girls in their store-bought dresses, music. Years later, she said, "I knew I was poor, but I didn't know I was supposed to be ashamed of it until I saw how people looked at me." She was less than, and that wound carved into her young heart would never fully heal. But Dolly's childhood wasn't defined only by suffering. It was also shaped by music. Her mother sang old Appalachian ballads while cooking beans over the wood stove. Her grandfather, a Pentecostal preacher, filled Sunday services with fervent gospel hymns that shook the walls of the tiny mountain church. Music became the only currency the Parton family had in abundance. By the time Dolly was 7 years old, she was writing her own songs, scratching lyrics onto scraps of paper with broken pencils. At 10, she was performing on local radio stations in Knoxville, her voice already carrying a power and emotion far beyond her years. At 13, she made her debut at the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, standing on that legendary stage in a homemade dress, music trembling but determined. Yet, even as she sang, even as applause echoed around her, the poverty never loosened its grip. Back home, there were still nights when dinner was nothing but cornbread and beans. Nights when her father sat at the table, head in his hands, silently crushed by the weight of mouths he couldn't feed. Nights when Dolly lay awake, staring at the ceiling, vowing with music every fiber of her being that she would escape. I had to get out, she later confessed. Not because I didn't love my family. Above everything, I adored them. However, I was aware that I would perish in that poverty if I stayed. I would end up in the mountains as just another forgotten girl. Dolly Parton therefore didn't wait until the day following her high school graduation in 1964. After packing everything she owned into a cardboard bag and bidding farewell to her sobbing mother, she boarded a Greyhound bus headed for Nashville. At the age of 18, she had a guitar, $20, and an unwavering conviction that her voice would eventually be heard somewhere beyond those mountains. Her early years had been harsh. She was hungry, scarred, and plagued by shame. However, it had also created something indestructible within her. A fire that could never be put out by rejection, derision, or a closed door. The barefoot girl from the one-room cottage was about to enter a field that would try to destroy her. But she had already made it through worse. Dolly Parton thought her ability would speak for itself when she moved to Nashville in 1964. She thought her songs, her voice, and her willpower would enough. She was mistaken. Nashville consumed dreamers despite being a city based on aspirations. Hundreds of young aspirants poured into Music Row every day. Believing they were destined for fame, they carried guitars over their shoulders. The majority were left shattered, forgotten, and buried under the burden of rejection. Dolly was adamant about not fitting in. She relocated to a small roach-infested apartment with just enough space for her to turn around. Even if the rent was inexpensive, it was still costly when you had nothing. She made do with whatever free food she could find, crackers and ketchup packets she stole from diners. On certain nights, her tummy rumbled as she went to sleep. The hunger was a harsh reminder of the early years she believed she had left behind. Every door she could find was pounded on radio stations, publishing houses, record labels anywhere that could offer her a chance. However, the doors didn't simply shut. They gave a forceful slam. Executives saw a joke in her. They observed a female wearing too tight clothing, too much makeup, and too much hair. Before she could even open her mouth to sing, they discarded her due to her strong mountain accent. "You're too country for country music," one executive told her simply, while another chuckled and added, "Honey, go home. Nashville doesn't need another nobody." The worst rejection occurred when they allowed her to sing. She would give her all during a performance, her notes quivering with passion, only to receive apathetic shrugs. "Your voice is too high-pitched," they remarked. "Your songs are too easy. No one will ever take you seriously." With each rejection, a bit more was chiseled. The same untruth she had heard as a youngster was spoken in every dismissal. "You're insufficient." Dolly questioned whether they were correct during those times when she was by herself in her small apartment. Perhaps she was deluding herself. Perhaps Nashville wasn't the right place for the girl from the mountains. However, Dolly would not give up. She took any job she could find, including waitressing, singing demos for other musicians, and working odd jobs that barely covered her expenses. Heartbreak, homesickness, and an unwavering resolve to give up drove her to write songs non-stop, filling notebooks with lyrics. Then, in 1966, a tiny ray of optimism emerged. She received a contract offer from Monument Records, a failing label. It wasn't the ideal arrangement she had envisioned. It was low-paying, constrictive, and required creative control that she lacked. Despite its narrowness, Dolly kicked it open. 1967 saw the release of her debut single, Dumb Blonde. It was a hymn of defiance, a jab at everyone who had misjudged her. The song made its way up the charts, peaking at music number 24 on the country charts. Her name was being heard for the first time. She wasn't invisible for the first time. But there was a cost associated with music success. Monument Records aimed to transform her into something less country, more pop, and more acceptable. They intended to take away the core of her identity. The big-haired mountain girl with loftier aspirations? Dolly resisted, but the label was in control. She silently swallowed her dissatisfaction, recorded songs she didn't believe in, and grinned through photos that made her feel like a product. Even worse, the money didn't come in as her songs started to chart. Her contract was predatory, intended to keep her in poverty while enriching the label. Even though she was selling records, she was barely making ends meet and was constantly plagued by the worry that everything may vanish at any time. Then there was the isolation. Despite the large number of people in Nashville, Dolly felt completely alone. Friendships were commercial, the profession was ruthless, and trust was a luxury that no one could afford. She missed the simplicity of a life where love was more important than money, the mountains, and her family. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. I thought maybe I should just go home, marry a local boy, and forget about all of this, she later acknowledged. However, fate intervened in the form of a man named Porter Wagner, just as music despair threatened to consume her. Porter, a country music icon, was well known for both his syndicated television